All right, so I'll start with introducing myself a little bit. I'm Avani Sabade. I'm from India. I was the first Indian women's rugby team captain. As some of you might have heard yesterday, we were amongst the first few women, so I'll talk about that a little later, who started playing the sport in India, and then the Indian team sort of went from there. I can hardly see that. Is it okay if I stand up and walk around? Yeah? All right. So just to follow. All right. So what I want to do today is talk about how women's rugby developed in India and how in the process of that development, there was sort of a focus more on the women and many of the marginalized communities in India. So there's a lot of tribal and rural development that has happened through rugby that I want to sort of focus on. And more importantly, what I sort of want to do is because of this, the kind of impact that it's had in terms of, so I mean, three things that I think are very, very difficult to achieve in a lot of countries: equal opportunities, equal pay, and a growing network of allies is developing in a country which, has its own patriarchal issues, but is still, through sport, is able to achieve something of this sort. So I'm trying to connect how the type of development that happened and how that had this impact outside of both rugby and sport on society. So can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So to start with, to place rugby in the sporting ecosystem of India, as some of you might know, India is a very single sport oriented country. Men's cricket is sport. Some of you may know Sachin Tendulkar is treated as a god. So when we think sport, we think men's cricket. Because of that, the audience that we have is also almost entirely either watching the national, international tournaments, or they are now over the last 10-15 years, there has been the National Premier League, the IPL, which is a big money maker in terms of audiences, in terms of merchandise. So that's the only business model as such that exists. Outside of men's cricket, there's not a lot of business models that exist. So the way the ecosystem works is all the other sports that compete at the Olympics, that compete in mega events, have to rely on national funding. So they basically have either Indian governmental funding, through which there are different bodies that will fund athletes, that will scout athletes. So that happens primarily for high performance type events. So that's one mode. Another mode also, if any of you know about the recent hockey success that India has sort of been able to revive, that has come through a state funding. So it's a state in India that has sort of sponsored the national team and has taken over sort of developmental work for them. The third newer player in the broader ecosystem are these grassroots and high performance. So they work across both, and they're basically not for profits. So with CSR becoming mandatory in India, sports was one of the, so in addition to education and a few other things, sports was one of the goals that was given to corporate social responsibility, which sees a lot of not-for-profits having huge training centers. So if any of you know of Neeraj Chopra, he started his journey from a similar high performance training center. So we have other athletes who are now making other sports popular. So we have Olympics having great viewership, we have mega events having great viewership, but most of that has come through some players having achieved great success. So the typical examples I think I have down here would be Neeraj Chopra, PV Sindhu. The hockey team, both women's and men's, is doing well enough, again, precisely because they've had really good performances. So to get to a sort of commercialization space, popularity and high performance is very, very important, which over the last few years, with the exception of the COVID years, of course, men's football league has been a consistent one. They're gaining a little bit of popularity. They're finally now sort of not just professional, but also commercialized. So professionalization also happens in India, based on national bodies funding, or so you are a professional athlete who's sponsored either by the government of India and some of their bodies, or some of the not-profits. So now in all of this very complex scenario, rugby has been played for a very, very long time. Under the British rule, British teams used to play rugby against each other, but that didn't pick up. The way cricket and hockey picked up, rugby did not pick up. It's been more recent that rugby is being played. So men's team, I think, started sometime in '98 or so. Women's team, the first team so I played in was in 2009. From 2009, just last year, they have already achieved professionalization. So there is a national funding body that now makes sure that any player that comes into national camp is paid for that time. So I'll talk about how that sort of also works in addition to that professionalization, how they're also supported in different ways in just a little while. Next slide, please. All right, so like I said, much of the popularity of the sport and much of the performance of the sport, I have snuck in a picture of myself playing 15-a-side rugby there, which yet again we see a lot of popularity of the women's sport. Rugby was better known once the 2009 women's team was formed. Both the men's and women's team in 2010-11 went to the Asian Games, but women got a lot of coverage. Women also are a bigger sort of presence on social media. So they've had a lot more popularity. They've had attention both from, so to speak, traditional media, of the print kind, new media, of the sort of blogs. So there's a lot of YouTube stories, a lot of blogs being written about their interesting stories. Similarly, if you think about social media, many of the women who have come from very, very diverse backgrounds have very, very interesting stories to tell, and that's reflected in social media. Many of them have huge followings. A lot of men rugby players in India don't necessarily have the kind of following that women do. So in fact, it's through the women. So currently they just played the Asian Games. Only the women's team qualified to play the Asian Games. There were injuries and there were issues, so the team hasn't performed as well as they had hoped. But I mean, their women's side is, so to speak, performing better. They've been improving their rankings. They've been playing for a shorter period of time, but their performance has been more consistent. Their performance has been improving slowly. So they're a lot more, so to speak, in the public eye, and that's helped the sport grow. So I'm sort of calling this women-centered development of rugby. Because women were doing better, a lot of the programs, a lot of the developmental initiatives were planned thinking about getting more girls and women involved in the sport. Have I covered everything? So I'll just add a few really important examples of sports for development. So sports for development, I'm sure most of you know, is using sport as a tool for some social developmental goals. And in India, again, there are, especially with rugby, there are quite a few initiatives that have worked really, really well. Especially when we think about, so Magic Bus is not operational under rugby anymore, but they've created players who are still in the ecosystem, who have now reached the coaching stages. Kalinga Institute of Social Sciences is in Orissa. There is an entire, in one of the biggest cities in that state, there is an institute where tribal children can come and start learning. So they start learning, so it's literally right from the beginning all the way to your masters. And while they do that, they're introduced to rugby. So one of the sports that they're introduced to is rugby. And you might be able to see some of those players are currently the most consistent, the most sort of regular players in the Indian team as well. So that, similarly, Jungle Crows is another team based in Kolkata that similarly has sort of started off as an initiative to allow rural girls to have access to sport. From that, they started playing, and now most of them make it to the India team very regularly. So this is very close to my heart. I think what's the interesting outcome that this has had is in terms of equal opportunities, which I think is very, very difficult to achieve in quite a few places. By equal opportunities, I mean quite a few different socio-economic opportunities that are now available both to men and women. With rugby becoming Olympic sport, the national games, national university games, national youth games, so that entire ecosystem is created, and because of that entire ecosystem, they all have access to many colleges that now offer free education. So quite a few of the girls that I personally know who play in my state team, many of them are currently studying physical education, and now they aspire to become coaches in universities. So that entire sort of opportunity has opened up in a big, big way for both men and women. One of the Delhi players who's also in the Indian team, also who played Asian Games, based on that certificate was able to get sort of education in physical education and then get into a university from that track. So that's educational. I teach philosophy, so education is very, very important, and that's sort of a founding stone for me. So when I see girls who otherwise wouldn't have had access to education, who are now getting not just education but fully funded, full scholarship education, I think that's a really big thing that's introduced across both men and women. They've also had access now to government jobs, which in India are highly sought after. A government job sort of secures a lot of different things, again, socio-economically for you. Government jobs will include many different kinds of jobs. One of them is also in the military. So again, one of my teammates from the state team was able to use a lot of her national certificates when she was applying to get into the army. And that helped her quite a bit. So a lot of these doors have opened up, not just for men, but also for women. There's again, very beautiful stories on YouTube, if you look it up, where many of them talk about how girls were treated as, well, you're going to have to get married very soon, so you need to start learning to cook, clean. From that, when they were introduced to rugby and when they come back from having played either for their state or for the nation, the entire town sort of is so impressed and they all want their younger daughters to learn from them. So that kind of social change, status of those women changing drastically within that society, I think is also a very big, important change. Equal pay. There are so the equal pay and equal opportunities is also kind of connected. So I'll just talk about how that works together. Equal pay, so professionalization happened just last year, right after COVID, when they were starting to have national camps again, state camps again. Any player who comes into the national camp for the entire duration of the camp and the tournament and everything, now on, they are being paid to do that. So professionalization has taken place. What I think is also equally important is whoever is in the Indian camp is sort of being paid to be playing for the country is also given other opportunities. So many of them also work simultaneously in jobs that are sort of close enough to rugby or sports. So quite a few of them train in gyms, quite a few of them are trainers in sort of our freelance trainers. That's the current captain, Wabis, who, I personally remember because we were in camp throughout together. She has finished her physiotherapy training entirely in and out of camps. 2 minutes? All right. So I will quickly skip over to the growing allyships. So with this, when I first went, as I was about 15 or so then, a group of young girls who went on and said, well, we really want to play rugby. We were told, yeah, sure, we can play touch tournaments together. We can mix up and play touch tournaments. And we were like, no, we want to play contact. And that was a big, big shock to the men's teams. From that, I now see many of those same men having sort of navigated, well, women are playing, now how do we support them? So from women can't play contact rugby to now you have many of these men going into roles of coaches who have taken over many of the teams, which includes the Delhi team, which is another powerhouse of women's rugby. The next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so I just wanted to highlight all these things because I think with a women-centric developmental initiative, what India has been able to achieve, I think, is quite interesting. What other factors went into the focus being on women itself is interesting, but just looking at the outcomes, which I think are difficult to achieve in quite a few countries, especially where rugby is already popular. So if men's rugby is popular, women are struggling to sort of get equal opportunities, equal pay. For more of a developing rugby nation, I think there's interesting insights in the way Indian rugby has developed. So that's all I wanted to present. That's it. Thank you.
Any questions?
Maybe. Thank you for the presentation. From here, India is a so big country. So is it developed everywhere? I mean, in India, or is it centralized, I don't know, in south, middle of India?
So currently the development is happening all across the states. So almost all the states and services team. So there are almost every state, from the tiniest to the bigger ones, they all participate in rugby, but there are some powerhouses. So when you think about Maharashtra, when you think about Delhi, so there's one on the west, two on the east, and one in the north. So these three are sort of the powerhouses that are driving rugby, but they're sort of also working in zones. So Maharashtra team will sort of work with the teams that are close to them, do developmental activities with them. So almost every state participates in rugby. So in terms of numbers and participation, we have huge growth happening over the last few years.
Yep. And could you talk a little bit, what are those numbers? Are they, are they tens of thousands? Are they the girls at the youngest level participating? And what does the kind of professional, semi-professional, what's the size, the pool of players?
In terms of the professional, semi-professional, it would be in the hundreds, because that's the number of players who are invited to camp and then they go through the ecosystem. The numbers are growing. Yes, it's probably in the hundreds of thousands, because Get Into Rugby program is also running very, very well in India. And because they're able to, again, use it not just as a rugby Get Into Rugby sort of a thing, but as a developmental initiative through it, they're able to bring a lot of rural populations, a lot of tribal populations, and a lot of girls into it. So the numbers are growing constantly.
Great. And do you, when you look at this as a blueprint for India, do you talk with other nations, with other, because I can see many parallels with other either developed or developing nations in the rugby ecosystem that would really benefit from working together, especially if you look at something, like a Fiji or something, for example, where they may only be able to draw on 200,000 or 300,000 players as men or women. The scale that you could have and the things that you could probably do together or consistently is amazing. So do you have any kind of connection into those other unions, or?
Not yet, hoping to form them. So, I mean, of course, we have, so again, because men's team has existed for longer, they have connections. So we work very closely with Japan Rugby, South Africa Rugby. So these are already existing ones. But because women's development itself is a lot more recent, those connections are still sort of in the formation.
I'm interested in the image sort of representation dimension of it, because it's quite interesting. You mentioned that rugby didn't take off, although with the British influence, and the development is now around women. So how is it perceived by, I would say, the general population? Is it like only a sport for women and maybe like a good opportunity for marginalized women, and let's say, okay, that's great, but it will remain in their own sort of a little world? Or is it just the step to become like a bigger and wider and in the larger population?
I think it's a combination of both. So it is sort of, so sport in general is treated anywhere where we're playing competitive sports. Most of those sports are treated not just necessarily marginalized, but even socio-economically backward communities would want, so to speak, their children to achieve high there, because that's sort of a way out of any issues that they may have. Now, in this process, there is very much the ambition to want to play at a higher level, which one of the sports would be rugby, but that's not the only way rugby is perceived. Rugby is also very much, because the powerhouses originally still sort of come from that British influence where the two main clubs that were formed by the British are the ones who are sort of still producing, who are still very much in charge of the coaching and sort of developmental initiatives. So it's very much a combination of the two. So there's a lot of women, men, younger girls and boys who are all involved because they see these stories of women having achieved so much in it, that it's such a great thing, not just for the marginalized communities, but for everyone. It's very inspiring for everyone.
And if I can add about, this is a contact sport, like you mentioned, and women want to play contact sport. So again, it's quite surprising that there is this development with this sport and not, I don't know, netball or
I think, again, historically, the time at which our first team was formed was after this movie called Chakde India, which is a film about women's hockey achieving great success, which is based on real life events. Similar time, we've had our weightlifting women, wrestling women, boxing women achieve very, very high success. So when they think women athlete, they think these, very strong, very intense contact sports women. So in fact, a rugby athlete is quite natural because now the team component is added. So I think, in fact, this is my personal sort of putting together different factors that may have gone into it.
Thank you. Interesting. So cinema and movies have a important role there.
So I say that because when the team was formed and at a press conference, I was the captain, so I was seated up front and I was asked, is this your Chakde India moment? So they were asking me, are you going to perform just like the team did in the movie? And I was like, oh, that's movie, slightly different things that we're looking to achieve here. So that's the kind of perception press had at the time.
Thank you. Any other question?
What does the infrastructure look like to play? Are you just out in fields? Are there proper pitches and structure and support around that? And then there's, to add on to that, I'm interested in what's the kind of culture look like around the fans and the audience? What do they enjoy? Is it families? Is it crossing ethnic? The things like the caste system, all those type of things. I'm just interested whether it breaks down some of those things. So one would be, do you have 1 million pitches or 2, and are people just going and playing in a park and throwing a ball around? And then I'm interested in that culture that's around the game.
I think it's a combination of both. There are some pitches that are sort of reserved for rugby, so you will have a few of those where the national teams will train. Like I said, the Orissa state has sponsored quite a few sports. Hockey is the popular one. They hosted the World Cup. But rugby is also another sport where they have a dedicated rugby field, which is accessed by... and similarly, you will have a few large grounds and facilities associated with it. But yes, most of the state teams, most of the local teams will very much find any ground. So local university ground is what you will go find and you will play together. And yes, the audiences cut across many boundaries precisely because the players do. So when teams are formed, that team itself is cutting across so many boundaries when that first gender boundary is broken, it's easy to navigate some of the others. So with that impact you can see also in the audiences, and it's not as much a spectator sport as we'd like for it to be. So that's another thing that we're currently working on. We have a local app. Actually not a local app. So we have an app that now streams all the games, which now allows us to have audience beyond just the one on the field, because large nation, very difficult to travel to watch games. So that growing ecosystem is helping quite a bit.
Thank you. So time is over. So thank you very much. And so we can then pass and get ready for the next presentation. Thank you again.